As we enter into the classical period of Greek philosophical thought, the nature of our textual evidence changes. We're no longer exclusively reliant on doxographic, that is, secondary source references, and fragments devoid of textual context. Instead, with Plato, for example, we have an enormous corpus of complete and uncorrupted text written explicitly for public consumption. In the case of Aristotle, however, the story is more complicated. We know that Aristotle, like Plato, wrote his works for public consumption in dialogue form, but none of those survive. What we have are notes by him, by his students, possibly rough drafts to be developed into public-facing works, but none of the works, even the Nicomachean Ethics, for example, is in fact one of Aristotle's works written for public consumption. Nevertheless, we can see that during this period of time, philosophers are writing specialized tracts. They're writing texts in philosophy of mind, in epistemology, in political philosophy, in metaphysics. They're articulating and defending theses in these texts at great length. For example, Plato famously formulates and defends a dualistic ontological framework. Another important theme in Plato's writing strongly associates the soul with the mind and the mind with reason, elevating reason as the most fundamental faculty or function of the human soul. These two theses are interwoven throughout Plato's works. They tie them together, but they also create rifts within them. Because Plato elevates reason in his writings, it's quite natural that Plato wants to turn his attention to understanding the nature of knowledge. How is knowledge possible? And he wants to respond both to the skeptics in the pre-Socratic tradition and to the relativists in the pre-Socratic tradition. He wants to explain how knowledge is possible and why we can fail to know as well. Plato's response to this epistemic quandary, as we'll see, combines both ontology and psychology. Part of the reason why we can know things about the world has to do with the sorts of objects that correspond to those judgments. Part of the reason why we know about the world is that we have faculties that allow us to access those objects. In focusing on reason, Plato also implicitly assumes an answer to other epistemological questions, specifically about our ability to know the nature of our own and others' minds. Plato, in focusing on reason, and particularly in focusing on the faculties that he thinks tie us to the world in our acts of reasoning, Plato is choosing to tie the notion of the mind to phenomenon on the most comfortable ground, our subjective lived experience. In addition to offering an account of how reason allows us to know about the world, Plato offers an account of how reason guides action in the world. Plato's dualistic oppositional ontological framework will face the problems of interaction common to oppositional ontological frameworks. Finally, we'll see that Plato's ontological framework, and ironically, we'll see that Plato's dualistic oppositional ontological framework cannot consistently and systematically account for the soul itself. The soul, as we'll see, doesn't fit neatly into any of the fundamental categories of Plato's dualistic oppositional ontological framework.